long were the Israelites in Egypt? In Exodus 12:40 it says, "Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. And so because of this, movies like the Ten Commandments will say things like this.
That's a hard dance you do, old man. We've been dancing it for 400 years.
400 years we have waited.
400 years in bondage, and today he won't move.
After 400 years of slavery.
And experts on the topic will say things like this.
The Israelites were there 430 years. We have the record in the Bible that tells about the Israelites going into Egypt and living there for 430 years.
But if you do the math, you'll find that this is not mathematically possible. You see, Moses was 80 years old when they left Egypt. His father Amram lived to 137. His father Kohath lived to 133. And Kohath was one of the 66 persons who went with Jacob down into Egypt. Now let's just stretch this out as much as we possibly can. Let's assume that Kohath was a newborn baby when he arrived in Egypt. Let's assume that Amram was born the year that his father died, and let's assume that Moses was born the year that his father died. So take 133 plus 137 plus 80, and that equals 350, which means that the amount of time the Israelites were in Egypt could have been no longer than 350 years maximum. Now, more than likely, Kohath was probably not a newborn baby when he arrived in Egypt. More than likely, Moses was not born the year that his father died, and more than likely, Amram was not born the year that his father died, which means that the amount of time the Israelites were in Egypt would have been significantly less than 350 years. So why does Exodus 12:40 say the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years when this is not mathematically possible? The key is found in one of Paul's letters. In Galatians 3:16 and 17, Paul says, "Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. And this I say, that the law, which was 430 years later, cannot annul the covenant that was confirmed before by God in Christ." Basically, Paul is saying that from the time that Abraham received the promise to the time that Moses received the law, there was 430 years. Well, Abraham received the promise when he entered Canaan when he was 75 years old. Then, 25 years later, when Abraham was 100 years old, that's when Isaac was born. Then, 60 years later, when Isaac was 60 years old, that's when Jacob was born. Then, 130 years later, when Jacob was 130 years old, that's when all of Israel arrived in Egypt. So take 25 plus 60 plus 130, and that equals 215, which means that there was 215 years from the time that Abraham entered Canaan to the time that all of Israel arrived in Egypt. Now, Moses received the law at the same time that they left Egypt, because remember, the Israelites were living in Goshen, and then Moses led them out of Goshen, brought them through the wilderness, and brought them to the sea. And then God split the waters of the sea in half and brought them into Midian, which is in Arabia, then brought them to Mount Sinai, which is where Moses received the law. And so Moses received the law at the same time they left Egypt. So Paul is saying that there was 430 years from this point to this point, and according to the Old Testament, there's 215 years from this point to this point. So take 430 years and then subtract 215 years, and that equals 215, which means that the amount of time that the Israelites were in Egypt was 215 years. 215 in Egypt, 215 in Canaan, 430 total. Now that is mathematically possible, because 215 is significantly less than 350. And that's exactly what the Greek Septuagint says in Exodus 12:40. It says, "And the sojourning of the children of Israel while they sojourn in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan was 430 years. The Samaritan Pentateuch says the same thing. It says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel and of their fathers, which they had dwelt in the land of Canaan and in Egypt, was 430 years.
Now, the creator of that video did a great job explaining how doctrine has created the ideas that people have about this religion over what the actual book says. So we know based on the actual book that the doctrine of over 400 years in slavery in Egypt, in Egypt is a lie. And that this is a doctrine that has been pushed out by the church over the centuries. And this is what most people believe because, one, they've never read their book. Two, they lack the understanding of their own book. We see this evidence everywhere. But let's dig a little deeper, a little bit deeper, to show how the Exodus story actually never happened. Just utilizing the information that was provided by the creator of that video. So according to the movies and what people say, that they were in slavery for the entire time. For 400 years, they were in slavery. No, they weren't, according to the book. According to the book, when they first came to Egypt, after 215 years of being in the land of Canaan, and then there was a drought, they came into a land of Egypt where they were not slaves, but actually their youngest brother, Joseph, was second in command. Now, there is absolutely no evidence that would demonstrate that there ever has been an Israelite or a Semitic person who was in second in command within the Egyptian dynasties. And if you want to further understand what time frame to look at to find this information on your own, then you have to look at 1 Kings 6th chapter, verse 1. It says that it had, from the building of the Temple of Solomon, from that reign, that time frame, it had been 480 years since the Exodus occurred. So the 480 years since the Exodus occurred, that would place it in and around 1446 BCE. This would have been during the reign of Thutmose III. And during that reign of Thutmose III, it shows that Egypt, archaeology shows that Egypt flourished during this time militarily and economically. So all the plagues and everything that would have happened, which would have destroyed the economics of Egypt at that time frame, and much of the world, of the Mediterranean world at that time frame, those things didn't happen. The Egypt flourished under Thutmose III. It flourished when he was in co-regent with Hatshepsut. And after Thutmose III with Amenhotep II, Egypt continued to flourish. And by the way, Egypt was in control of the Levant during that entire time frame. So they would have left Egypt for even more Egypt. Just puppet states of Egypt, but they would have left Egypt for more Egyptian control. But the economy of Egypt didn't take a downturn. The military didn't take a downturn during the time frame of Thutmose III. And if you were to look 215 years prior to Thutmose III, which would then put you in and around 1661, in around 1661, then you would have found that there was no Semitic person who was second in command, which then invalidates the Joseph story. You will see that there was no migration of Israelites, and the numbering 70 people who then were running the king's cattle, maintaining the king's cattle and sheep and whatnot up in Goshen. There's zero evidence of this during that time frame. As a matter of fact, what you will find during this time frame is, a couple of hundred years before that, around that time frame actually, is the Hyksos invasion. And the Hyksos were Semitic people who took over the northern parts of Egypt, but yet these are not the people. They were then defeated by an Egyptian army and driven out of Egypt. So the evidence, the historical evidence, the archaeological evidence shows that this did not happen, and it could not have happened under Thutmose, and they weren't there for 430 years in Egypt, that they spent part of their time in Canaan, which was controlled by Egypt, and part of their time in actual Egypt, according to the biblical narrative. Now, if you want to say, you can possibly say that since Egypt controlled the Levant during that 215 years, that Egypt controlled it for most of the time, but some of that time it was controlled by the Hyksos, then you may be able to suggest that since they were under Egyptian rule, even in Canaan, that they were in Egypt, but they were never slaves during that time frame. So you see how the Bible doesn't match archaeology. And the more you dig into archaeology, the more you find out that the Bible is filled with hypocrisy, filled with contradictions, and is just flat out wrong. Also, you have to recognize that if they left in 1446, as far as what 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 says, then there is absolutely no way they would have been the builders of Pithom and Ramses and Pi-Ramses, because Pithom and Pi-Ramses was not built until Ramses came Pharaoh, which that was not until the 1200s BCE, a full 200 years later. So this is just people taking the knowledge that they had during their time frame and writing the Israelites into history, not actually writing history. So dig deeper, do the research, check it for yourself, and you'll find out that the Bible is completely non-historical in these affairs as far as the Exodus, and the Exodus never actually happened. That is just more fan fiction written in the Bible that people still believe today. So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.